Side 7. Chapter 16. Harry came awake in a blur. At first he thought he was in bed at home and it was Mam shaking his shoulder. He opened his eyes and there was this man's face, a total stranger's face, saying something he couldn't understand over and over again. He looked round desperately. He was in the open air, in a totally strange place he couldn't even remember coming to. Panic surged inside him. The man said the same thing again and again. What was he saying? With a lost, despairing effort, Harry focused his concentration. "Your dog's hurt," said the man. "You must get him to a vet." He looked at the man's face. The man flinched and looked away. At the sky, at the sea, anywhere but at Harry. What a strange man. The man looked at him again, a fleeting, almost guilty glance. "Can I look at the dog's paw?" he said, looking at Don. "Yes," said Harry. He couldn't understand this man at all. Maybe Don would understand him. He trusted Don's judgment. If Don let the man touch him, the man must be all right. Don let the man touch him. Let him stroke his ears. The man talked to Don in a gentle voice, calling him boy. Then he raised the hurt paw gently. Again Don let him. The man looked at the paw, then let go of it. Don licked the man's face with his long, pinky-purple tongue. The man came back, his face serious. "We must get him to a vet. That gash won't heal itself. He could lose his foot. He could die." "Okay," said Harry. He didn't understand anything except about Don's paw. The man helped Harry to his feet. His touch was soft, like a woman's. His hands were strong enough, but they trembled. Harry knew the man was terribly excited about something. The man put Harry into the seat next to the driver's seat. Then he pulled forward the driver's seat and piled all Harry's gear onto the back seat. The stuff dripped all over the cracked leather of the back seat, but Harry was beyond caring. Then the man coaxed Don into the back seat next to Harry's stuff, got in himself, and they were off. Not very fast. The car was little and old, and the engine sounded weak, as if it might give out at any moment. The windscreen was all yellowed round the edges, and there was some kind of silver dial on the front of the bonnet. The man drove silently, keeping his eyes on the road. His hands were very white and tight on the wheel. All he said was, "That cut paw's bad. Very bad. We must get it seen to, straight away." He said it 4 times without looking at Harry at all, as if to himself. The vet's was more reassuring. A big house with a big brass plate saying, "John Harper, MRCVS." Very highly polished, but with dried brasso in the lettering. Inside, there was highly polished brown lino, and it smelt like a hospital. The vet came bristling in his white coat, which had pale pink washed-out stains down the front. Now, what have we here?" He lifted Don onto the table, played with his ears a bit, then lifted the foot and said, "Oh, that's a nasty one. How'd you get that?" "On an iron ladder," said Harry in a very small voice, then added, "Is he going to be all right?" "Be a big job," said the vet. "I'll have to chloroform him before I can see to it. And I'll have to keep him in for a few days. He'll have to be kept still." Harry despaired. "How much will that cost?" "You can leave that to me," said the man with the car. He gabbled it like he was saying something shameful. "Right, Mr. Murgatroyd," said the vet. There was something odd in his voice as he said it. It wasn't dislike, it was more pity. As if Mr. Murgatroyd had a wooden leg or was deformed or something. "Right then, we'd better get on with it straight away. Sooner it's done, the better." And he picked up Don and carried him away through an open door without even giving Harry a chance to say goodbye. "Give me a call this evening, Mr. Murgatroyd. I'll let you know how you got on." And suddenly, Harry and Mr. Murgatroyd were outside and back at the car. Without Don, Harry was suddenly terribly embarrassed. He could think of nothing to say, but went on staring at the little silver dial on the bonnet of the car. Mr. Murgatroyd didn't seem to know what to say either. Then Harry reached in his raincoat pocket and felt the wet wadge of notes. "I've got money," he said, "only it's all stuck together." How do you mean?" asked Mr. Murgatroyd with a sudden burst of enthusiasm, as if he was glad he'd found something to say. Harry showed him. "If I wait till they're dry, I might be able to—" No, said Mr. Murgatroyd. "The way to separate them is to make them wetter. Come on, I'll show you." And he bundled Harry back into the car as if there was nothing in his life at all, half so important as separating some banknotes. It was quite a long drive, full of twists and turns. long enough to convince Harry he could never find his way back to Don on his own. Then they were arriving at a big grey stone farmhouse with windows each side of a blue door, but the man drove up the cobbles at the side to the back door. There was a large black and white cat sitting on the back doorstep. She came forward to greet Mr. Murgatroyd with a loud meow, a bushy black tail vertical. Mr. Murgatroyd bent to stroke her and started a long conversation. "Dinner time, is it, Mrs. Murgatroyd?" "Not really, you know. You're half an hour early, you scheming puss. You won't go to heaven telling such lies. You'll go down there, where the great dog will gobble you up. Why don't you go and catch your own dinner for once? Plenty of fat mice around the barns, only you'd rather sit in the sun and be a kept woman." And so on and so forth, as if he was never going to stop. And the cat talked back to him non-stop too, in a series of prooks and meows, striding backwards and forwards while he gently pulled her tail, until Harry could have died with embarrassment. Then Mr. Murgatroyd clapped his hand to his forehead and said, "Banknotes!" and dashed indoors. He filled an enamel basin in the sink from the cold tap, and took the solid wadge of notes and dropped them in. Harry watched anxiously while they just floated, waiting for them to dissolve into pure sludge at any moment. £14 10 4 weeks' wages for a grown man. He wondered if Mr. Murgatroyd was some kind of lunatic. The silence between them deepened and deepened. "Fancy a mug of tea?" asked Mr. Murgatroyd suddenly. "Yes, please." Well, at least that got rid of him and his terrible silence. It was all right while he was clinking and bustling around the kitchen. "Right," said Mr. Murgatroyd. Harry turned and saw a tray set not only with a mug of tea, but a neat embroidered little tray cloth, and a plate with 3 huge slices of fruit cake. "Help yourself to sugar." Harry stirred in 3 spoonfuls. The sight of all that cake made his stomach erupt as if it was full of fizzing soda pop. "Eat up all the cake if you want. It's Christmas cake, really. It needs finishing up." Mr. Murgatroyd settled into a chair and watched Harry eat. Why was he watching so closely? As if he was counting every crumb. He said it could all be eaten up. He was a jumpy person, sitting on the edge of his chair. Harry suddenly grew ashamed because his hands weren't all that clean. "Sorry, me hands are dirty." "Oh, don't worry about that," said Mr. Murgatroyd. "Don't worry about that at all. Not important. Not important." Then he got up and dashed from the room as if he'd been shot. Through the window, Harry saw him talking to the cat again. And the next time he looked, Mr. Murgatroyd had got a hold of a spade and was frantically digging up a patch of garden. Harry finished all the cake, even gathered the crumbs together with his finger end and ate them. Then he drained the tea to the last drop and still felt ravenously hungry, but it was all gone. So he drifted over to the window above the sink. Through the window he could see Mr. Murgatroyd had finished digging the patch of earth and was now frantically nailing up a bit of fence. Then he looked down. A miracle! £3 notes had floated free. They were nearly transparent with wet, but clear of the wadge. As he looked, another one began to curl free of the wadge. Mr. Murgatroyd wasn't as mad as he seemed. Harry tried to lift one of the floating notes out of the water. It tore nearly all the way across. No, said Mr. Murgatroyd, appearing suddenly at his elbow. "A fish slice and blotting paper. That's what you need, a fish slice and blotting paper." He'd come in so silently, Harry jumped a foot in the air. His heart still seemed to be pounding as he watched Mr. M fish out the lost note safely. "Put them by the fire, face upwards. Then even if they stick to the blotting paper, the bank manager can still read the signature and he'll still give you a new one." Harry had an awful vision of himself walking into a bank. "Don't worry," said Mr. M kindly. "I'll take them to the bank for you in the morning." "Oh, thanks." He gave Mr. M a smile. "Oh, don't thank me. No need for thanks." Mr. M's eyes were everywhere but Harry's face. "Anything else you want dried out? Stuff in the car? Get it for you." He fled again and returned panting with all the stuff. "Get you a clothes horse. Then you can see to things yourself. I'll make up the fire. Good fire. Good fire." Then he was off outdoors again. Harry hung what he could over the old wooden clothes horse. He laid the contents of the attaché case and the case itself out on the clippy rug before the fire, where they steamed gently. Then there was nothing to do. He watched Mr. M out of the window, leading a pair of goats past the gate, feeding a small flock of geese and talking to them. Mr. M seemed to talk to everything that moved. Harry wondered if he was balmy, like old Joseph. He didn't look balmy, tall and thin, with grey nibbled moustache and short-cut hair. His clothes were worn, but he looked very clean and neat. And he did everything very efficiently round the farm, and what he did seemed to make sense. Then there were all the books, lots of bookshelves, more books piled neatly in the corners of the room, big serious books, mainly history, but some poetry too, and a pile of war magazines in strict order of date, so that Harry hardly dared touch them. But the last one was badly out of date, 6 months old, and the top was thick with dust. He suddenly felt very tired again. He curled up in the big armchair by the fire with the lost magazine. He remembered it from home. He and Dad had bought the same magazine. But the lost copy was a miserable one. January 1942 and the sinking of the Repulse and Prince of Wales by those Japanese bombers. Had Mr. M stopped buying the magazines then because it was such a miserable number, full of bad news? The news had got better since then. Since the Battle of Midway, the Japs were on the run. He slept. "Wakey, wakey," said Mr. M. "Tea time. It's just bacon and eggs, but there's plenty of it." There was, too. 2 eggs and huge rashers of thick-cut bacon swimming in their own golden grease, and a pile of thick-cut white bread, and butter with dewdrops coming out of it. "That's a whole week's ration," gasped Harry. 2 weeks' rations. "Not round here. I know the farmers. Plenty if you know the farmers. I teach their sons. I don't go short." With a nervous flick of the eyes, Mr. M vanished behind a copy of Picture Post. A 6-month-old copy of Picture Post. He seemed able to eat and read at the same time, though from the tilt of his grey head visible above the magazine, he wasn't getting on very well with the article he was reading. "Rang the vet," he said with his mouth full. "Your dog's okay, just coming round from the chloroform nicely. Vet says you can go and see him tomorrow. I'll run you down there." "Oh, thanks," said Harry. "Thanks for being so kind." A fit of coughing broke out behind Picture Post. It went on and on. It appeared a large morsel of food had gone down the wrong way. Mr. M dropped the magazine onto his greasy plate and sat coughing helplessly, tears streaming down his face. Harry, alarmed he was going to choke to death, ran round and banged him firmly on the back. "Oh, thanks," said Mr. M, when the coughing had subsided at last. Abruptly, the painful silence fell again. Harry had never known a silence like it. It was scarcely endurable. It hung in the room like a great, dark, threatening shadow, making the tick of the clock far too loud. Every crack of the fire made you jump. "Fancy a walk?" said Mr. M abruptly. "I always have a walk before bed." The clock on the wall said 7 o'clock. Harry thought suddenly that Mr. M was having a fight with time itself. The same as he was having this terrible fight with silence. A silence that was choking him. Only, you couldn't fight with time. You couldn't fight with silence. It was as if, Harry struggled, as if there was another person in the house, an invisible person who was frightening Mr. M, out of his wits, using the weapons of time and silence. Only that was mad. A mad thought. Was Mr. M mad? Or was he going mad himself? Not a nice thought either way. "Yes, I'll come for a walk," said Harry. Mr. M set off at a great pace, so that Harry, still tired, had a great job in keeping up. Mr. M had an old battered pair of binoculars hung round his neck. He walked so fast they must have banged against his chest painfully. But it was a glorious evening, and they walked to the sea. Lindisfarne lay low and golden. The sea was in, and the 2 refuge towers stuck out of it. They stopped to admire the view, and Harry managed to get his breath back. Then he said, "We nearly drowned coming back from there. That's why everything's got so wet." "I thought it might be something like that," said Mr. M. He didn't seem all that interested. "Look, there's a fulmar. He comes every evening about this time and flies around and round this bit of cliff. Exactly the same pattern every time. I think he's just showing off." It was almost a joke. He did seem a little calmer, and the longer they walked, the calmer he got. He seemed to know a lot about birds and plants, and explained about them in a way that was eager and not at all show-off. It was a bit like going for a walk with Artie, only Mr. M knew longer Latin names for things. There were still silences, but they didn't drill into your brain like they did in the house. Only one odd thing happened. As they walked back through the village, having come off the cliffs, there was an old man standing smoking at his cottage door. "Evening, Mr. Murgatroyd." His tone was kind, but there was that same kind of weary pity in it. again as if Mr. M had a wooden leg or was deformed or something. "Evening, Sam. How's your lad?" There was a sudden tightness, as of pain, in Mr. M's voice. "Oh, doing fine," said the old man. "Making £14 a week in that Vickers factory at Newcastle. Churning out tanks like cans of beans they are, every hour God sends. He hardly has time to write. He's still keen to do his bit for his country, but he's in that controlled occupation." For a moment the old man sounded ashamed. Then he said, "Nice to see you with a young'un, Mr. Murgatroyd. Like old times, eh?" The sudden, silent cold was back. Harry, glancing at Mr. M, thought he looked 10 years older all of a sudden. Then Mr. M just said, "Good night, Sam," and walked on. "Everything's dry now," said Harry. Then he screwed up his courage and said, "Can I sleep in your barn tonight?" He didn't know what else to say. It was getting dark outside, and he had to make some arrangements. "You'll do no such thing," said Mr. M. "There's a bed upstairs for you if you want it. First room on the left, and if you want a bath, there's plenty of hot water. Bathroom second on the right. Now, I must go and fasten up the geese." And he was gone again before Harry could say thank you. So all Harry could do was go upstairs, taking his dried things with him. The bed was neatly turned down, and there were striped pyjamas laid out ready for him. Again, they were a bit big for him, but they were certainly far too small for Mr. M. And a towel, and a half-used bar of soap, and a half-used tube of toothpaste. It was strange having a hot bath again, and even stranger getting into somebody else's warm pyjamas twice in 3 nights. But the bed was soft, and he soon fell asleep. Chapter 17. Harry was awakened by the rattling of a cup and saucer outside his bedroom door. It was a really terrible rattling, as if Mr. M was shaking himself to pieces. Then there was a long, long pause, and that same terrible silence. When Harry felt he couldn't really take any more, and almost called out, the door opened. Mr. M stood there, fully clad. He had the cup and saucer in one hand, and a bundle of clothes under his other arm. That much Harry saw through the lashes of his near-closed eyes, for he felt it was wiser to pretend to be still asleep. Mr. M stood looking at Harry a very long time. At first, a slow smile crept across his face. Then slowly it faded. Mr. M's face grew sadder and sadder, until Harry almost cried out again, just to stop it getting worse. At that point, Mr. M crossed the room on tiptoe, put the rattling cup on the bedside table, and draped the clothes over a chair. There were corduroy trousers, a checked shirt, vest, and underpants and socks, and last a blue jumper. Mr. M arranged the clothes with little tugs, and then rearranged them again. Satisfied, he tiptoed to the door and looked at Harry's face again, with a stare so intense that Harry felt he was being eaten alive. Then he made a dash for Harry's old clothes, where he'd dropped them carelessly on the floor. He snatched them up avidly and vanished from the room, calling as he went suddenly, "Wakey, wakey, rise and shine!" Feeling rather shaky himself, Harry swung his legs down to the floor and drank the cup of tea. It had 3 sugars in. When he whipped out to the loo, there was the smell of frying bacon coming upstairs, so he thought he'd better get washed and dressed quickly. Mr. M seemed to have finished his breakfast. He was stuck behind the morning's Times. He said shortly, "Your breakfast's in the oven." It was bacon and eggs again, but Harry wasn't grumbling. After what he'd been through, he could eat bacon and eggs like that forever. He even mopped up the greasy plate with bread. "There's toast there," said Mr. M in a tight voice. Harry munched his way through a lot of toast and marmalade. Then he felt guilty again because of the rationing. "Is it all right if I finish it up?" Mr. M's face appeared fleetingly. He smiled as if he was really pleased. "I like a boy who eats a good breakfast," he said. "You need feeding up." Then his face vanished again. Harry stared at the large headlines of the paper. There'd been a victory in the Western Desert at a place called Alam Halfa. General Montgomery seemed to have destroyed a lot of Rommel's tanks. "Monty's given Rommel what for, then?" said Harry. Mr. M's hands tightened on the paper. "I never discussed the war," he said in a very small voice. Then he seemed to relent and lowered the paper and said, "We'd better go down and see how your dog's getting on." The car rattled and creaked along, and Mr. M rattled on non-stop about what a marvellous vet Mr. Harper was, how animals loved him, how cats twined around him, purring even when he was giving them injections. So it was a bit of an anticlimax to find when they arrived that Mr. Harper was out on his rounds. They were shown into the back area by a bad-tempered woman in an overall, who seemed to regard them as a nuisance. Don was in a pen on a bed of old blankets. He seemed sleepy and didn't get up, though his tail beat against the floor. They both went in and stroked him. Harry thought again how good Mr. M was with animals, and how bad he was with people. "He's all right," said Mr. M, still stroking Don. "He's just sleepy after his anaesthetic." Don's paw was tightly and neatly bandaged, but Harry was a bit worried that there was a little blood seeping through the bandage. "It's all right," said Mr. M. "Harper knows what he's doing." Then they were back in the car, with the silence growing between them, and the whole empty sunny day stretching ahead with nothing to do. Harry thought hard. He was getting increasingly nervous about what Mr. M wanted him for. All adults wanted something. Joseph had wanted help with beach combing. The old lady had wanted to... Well, Artie had wanted things fetched from the naffy. "Can I help?" he said diffidently, not looking at Mr. M, just staring through the windscreen at the little silver dial on the bonnet. "Help?" said Mr. M. He sounded most surprised. "Help with what?" "Well, I could do the washing up," said Harry. I helped me mum with the washing up. I didn't break anything." "Bless the boy," said Mr. M, to nobody in particular. "Yes, you can do the washing up if you like." "And can I help you with the farm? With the animals?" "It's not a farm," said Mr. M. "I've only got 4 acres. Goats, hens, geese. But you can help if you like." He seemed happier. He rattled on in great detail about goats, hens, and geese all the way home. It was as if Harry had opened a floodgate. Mr. M was right. It wasn't a farm, it was more like a zoo. There were 3 she-goats, and Harry had a go at milking Emily, the quiet one. There was also a very nasty billy goat, who spent all his time getting behind your back so he could butt you. "He hasn't got a very nice nature," said Mr. M. "But he was born here, and I couldn't bear to send him to market. He's got a right to live like anything else. I'm against death." He said it as if death was a person to be outwitted, and he was so against death that he spent 10 minutes in the hencree with a jam jar, trying to catch a wasp so he could put it safely out of the door. "I'd just swat wasps," said Harry, "but I'd never swat a bee." He remembered spending 10 minutes rescuing a bee in their kitchen at home with a jam jar in just the same way. "Never kill anything you can't create," said Mr. M. "Who gave you the power of life and death?" "What about germs?" asked Harry. Mr. M was silent for a long time after that, and Harry was sorry he'd been so smart-aleck, but it was a happy day on the whole, because they worked side by side, never looking each other in the face. Mr. M never looked people in the face, but he talked non-stop to make up. Harry could see that he really was a teacher, and he'd given all the animals names, not just the 4 cats, but every goose, even every hen. He knew everything about them. "That hen hurt her leg one night when I left her out of the cree by mistake. She can stand on 2 legs, but she only hops on 1. That black cat is the black and white one's kitten. He never left home. She still washes him every night, though he's twice her size, but she gets fed up with him sometimes and bites him on the neck when he's lying asleep." It was as if it was a kingdom of animals, and Mr. M was the king. On the 3rd morning, Harry, coming downstairs, heard a woman's voice in the kitchen. His hand was on the kitchen door handle when he heard the woman's voice say shrilly, "You can't do that, Mr. Murgatroyd. It's not right. It's downright wicked." Mr. M's voice was too low to make out what he said in reply. "He must have a mother and father somewhere, who must be worried sick about him," said the woman. Harry stayed frozen, silent. They were talking about him. Mr. M's voice murmured. The woman's voice rose higher. "You know what happened the last time? The police warned you. You could have lost your job. You could have gone to prison." Murmur, murmur. "I'll not stay in a house with such wickedness. I'm giving me notice. I'll not be a party to it." There was the sounds of movement. Just in time, Harry fled back upstairs. From the top of the stairs, he watched the woman storm out, buttoning up her coat. Timidly, he went downstairs again. Mr. M sat with his head in his hands, unmoving. Harry just stood watching. He seemed to watch forever. He'd never seen anyone sit like that. In the end, he said timidly, "Are you all right? Mr. M looked up as if he didn't know where he was. He was holding a photograph in a frame. Silently, he held it out to Harry. It was a photograph of a boy, laughing. A boy a bit older than Harry, but he was wearing a checked shirt, a blue pullover, corduroy trousers. The clothes Harry was wearing now. Harry looked up. Mr. M had his head in his hands again. "Who was he?" asked Harry. But he knew. The boy looked so much like Mr. Murgatroyd. He was his fourth top in his year at Dartmouth. He nearly won the Sword of Honour. He was only 18. 18, 5 months and 4 days. He was a midshipman, George Frederick Murgatroyd. His friends called him Freddie. He was on the Repulse. You know what happened to the Repulse? I remember, said Harry. Never even reached their target. Sheer waste. Sheer bloody waste. Then, tight-lipped, he took the photo off Harry and put it back in the cupboard and locked the door. Must go and see to the hens. What did you nearly get put in prison for? Harry didn't think it was the right time to ask, but he had to know. Mr. Murgatroyd sat down again. There was a boy. I was fond of him. He came here often. He was miserable at home. His father hit him a lot. One night he came to me. He was all bleeding. He said he wouldn't go home anymore. I said he could stay here. His father came for him. I threw the drunken sot out of my house. Yes, said Harry feelingly. Yes. The parents came back with a policeman. They accused me of enticing the boy, trying to steal their son. I had to let them have him. I could have lost my job. I could have gone to prison. It's a crime, you see. Enticement. Yes, said Harry. Why did they want him? Said Mr. M. If they hated him so much, don't they realise how precious sons are? He said it softly, but it was like a scream. Harry took a deep breath and said, My parents are dead. They were killed in the bombing. I haven't got nobody. It's no good, said Mr. M. That woman, Mrs. Cleeve, my cleaning lady, she'll gossip. I'll be the talk of the village. Somebody will tell the police villages are like that. Couldn't you talk to her? She won't listen to me. Harry got up. Perhaps she'll listen to me. Where does she live? Mr. M told him in a low voice, then put his head back in his hands. He seemed to be beyond caring. Harry knocked on Mrs. Cleeve's front door and waited. He knocked again, but there was still no answer. But he wasn't in any mood to go away. So he barged round the back and found Mrs. Cleeve hanging out washing, her mouth full of clothes pegs. They stared at each other. Harry thought Mrs. Cleeve didn't have an unkind face, just a worried one. And like Ma'am, worry would make her hasty. She would do things in a rush and be sorry after. Mrs. Cleeve needed slowing down. Please, said Harry, can I have a drink of water? I feel faint. Mrs. Cleeve bustled him into the kitchen and sat him in a chair and made him put his head between his knees. Harry didn't mind. She wouldn't just chuck him out of her kitchen like she might have chucked him out of her garden. After a little while he said he'd stopped feeling faint. And pleased with herself, Mrs. Cleeve said, I'll give you something better than water, and went and bought a glass of homemade lemon barley. Harry sipped it slowly, playing for time, waiting for Mrs. Cleeve to finally get out of her flap and start to feel nosy. His dad had always said that all women were nosy. Finally he said, Oh, this is lovely, just like me Mum used to make. Used to? Mrs. Cleeve was onto that like a flash. Me Mum's dead. Harry watched the look on Mrs. Cleeve's face change. He was no longer in any danger of being thought an impudent young pup or a damned young nuisance. He was now, in Mrs. Cleeve's mind, that poor wee bairn. Your mum can't have been a great age, said Mrs. Cleeve cautiously. She was killed in the bombing on Tyneside 2 months ago. Careful, don't rush her. So you and your dad'll be managing on your own? Oh, me dad was killed too by the same bomb. And while Mrs. Cleeve's face crumpled up with horror, he added, And me little sister. Was it terrible to use their memories like this? But you had to survive. Mum and Dad would have wanted him to survive. How did you escape? Asked Mrs. Cleeve, a tinge of suspicion still in her voice. We was down the shelter, me and me dog. We always went down first to get things ready. Well, haven't you got nobody? Just the dog. He wasn't going to mention Cousin Elsie. Cousin Elsie would be a very bad mistake. Mr. Murgatroyd was very kind when the dog hurt his foot. He took him to the vet's. He's still there till his foot gets better. How have you managed? Mrs. Cleeve was really hooked now. Her eyes were wide as saucers, her mouth slightly parted. Sleeping rough, till Mr. Murgatroyd phoned me. He's very kind. He's too kind for his own good, said Mrs. Cleeve, a voice softening. He's never been the same since that lad of his was killed off in Malaya. What happened to him? Asked Harry innocently. And Mrs. Cleeve was off. Mr. Murgatroyd's long sufferings, the death of his wife 5 years ago, bringing up the boy on his own, the boy's death, the other boy, the trouble with the police, and all the time Mrs. Cleeve's voice got softer, and several times she paused to wipe her eyes on her flowery pinafore. Harry did nothing but sigh and look incredulous, for hours and hours. In the end she stopped. Now was the crucial time. The idea must come from Mrs. Cleeve. I must be going, said Harry. Thank you very much for the nice lemonade. He got up. Going? Going where? Asked Mrs. Cleeve. Back on the road. I mustn't get Mr. Murgatroyd into any more trouble. But how will you manage? I'll manage. I managed before. But you're only a bairn. There should be people looking after you. They'd put me in a home, said Harry, and they'd put me dog to sleep, and the dog's the only thing I've got left. Goodbye. Thank you for the lemonade. Mrs. Cleeve looked bewildered. She passed her hand across her face. It doesn't bear thinking about little bits of bairns. Here, sit down while I put me thinking cap on. I'll make you a cup of tea, and there's some seedy cake left. Have some tea while I gather me wits. Harry sat and let himself be fed, while Mrs. Cleeve bustled about saying things like, I don't know what the world's coming to, and Hitler and his bloody Germans. Finally, she announced, We'll have to go and talk to Mr. Murgatroyd. Hang on a minute while I put on me coat and hat. Harry waited, and was content to wait. Mrs. Cleeve was in the conspiracy now, up to her neck. End of side 7.